Welcome to this week's episode of Growing Guelph. I'm your host, Jordan Sloggett. This week I spoke with Mike Smith. Mike is the farm coordinator for the Guelph Center for Urban Organic Farming, or the GCUOF, also known as the Campus Organic Farm. After that tour, we sat down in Mike's office on campus and talked about the goals of the center, the impact of taking part in an organic farm each year for hundreds of student volunteers, and all sorts of other topics around the intersection of agriculture outreach, education, and exploring organic agriculture. Thanks to Mike for reaching out to me and inviting me to learn more. And as always, if you have a story worth telling or want to suggest who I speak to next, let me know. And now on to my discussion with Mike Smith. They all start pretty casually, usually. Sure. Just me saying, thanks so much for joining me today, Mike. I am joined by Mike Smith. Mike, sorry, what's your full title?
I'm the farm coordinator at the Guelph Center for Urban Organic Farming.
Very cool. And we just went on a tour. You took me and my wife Allison on a little tour of you call it the Campus Organic Farm?
That's sort of the informal name, as the official name of the Guelph Center for Urban Organic Farming, or the GCUOF is a bit of a long-winded way. A lot of acronyms. The campus has a lot of acronyms, so just referring to it as the Campus Organic Farm I think is a little bit more succinct.
Yeah. And the organic farm borders the Guelph Arboretum, or it's part of the Arboretum, but it's kind of on what was the coordinates of it? Like compass coordinates that we were?
Yeah, so we're in the northwestern corner of the Guelph Arboretum. So we're located within the Arboretum, and so we're a program of the Department of Plant Agriculture.
So I guess just to start things off, Mike, can you give us an overview of the Guelph Center for Organic Farming and what its main mission is and how it kind of came to be established?
Sure. So the Guelph Center for Urban Organic Farming, the general premise is, as a program of the Department of Plant Agriculture, is as the University of Guelph is Canada's food university, this is an opportunity for students to connect with agriculture. Perhaps who aren't familiar with agriculture. They're not taking agriculture in school. They may have only heard of it now that they are studying at a post-secondary institution a little bit more about farming and food. So this is an opportunity for students and members of the communities to connect and be with opportunities to get their hands dirty by either volunteering or just coming for a tour and walking around to see what the space is like. One of the things that I really value about the Campus Organic Farm is that since we are located in the Arboretum, we're open during daylight hours, 365 days a year, just like the Arboretum. So if you're coming off the Trillium Trail, you can take a walk and see all the different crops that we have growing. So we grow usually around 80 different crops, 60 of which are mostly vegetables, but we also grow some flowers, fruits, and herbs to give a well-rounded approach to what you can grow at a mixed farm here in Ontario.
Very cool. And then all those good things that you grow, what happens to them?
So the food that students grow on the campus farm goes back to students one way or the other. So we sell a lot of the produce to hospitality services. I'm sure you're aware, not as many students are on campus during the summer months, which is, in turn, great growing weather. So we supply a number of things to hospitality services, which for our listeners who aren't aware is the single food service provider here at the University of Guelph. They're our contracted company, but a part of the university who has been award-winning in terms of producing high-quality food here on campus. And so that food we sell to them, but we also do a sliding scale market for students in the fall. We partner with the U of G market group and being like a farmer's market stall. And that sliding scale market, we offer wholesale to retail prices, and then students decide what pay they are going to, or how much they're going to pay for the things that they're going to purchase that week. And then we also donate to the campus food bank here on campus.
Oh, very cool. So I guess something as a definition that we should explain to listeners is what does organic farming mean? I think a lot of people hear that term, they see produce, they understand it, that there's something different that's done with it, and that they end up usually paying a bit of a higher price for organic produce, organic food of any type. But what does organic actually mean?
Sure. So in Canada, the term organic is a legal term. If you're going to call something organic, it means that you need to be certified organic by an independent third party if you're selling that product across a national or a provincial boundary. So in order to be certified organic, you need to have a relationship with a third party certifier. So we use EcoCert, which is an international certifier, but they are based here in Guelph, Ontario, for the Eastern Canada, I believe. So that means that we have to follow the Canadian Organic Standard, which is available if anyone's curious about the big list of do's and don'ts that you're allowed to do. Often people are associating with probably a part of that called the Permitted Substance List, which is the big list of things I'm allowed to put on crops in our fields and which things I'm not allowed to. Often people think about pesticides and herbicides as something that we're not allowed to use. So for us, it's anything that is chemical based. So if, an example would be a fertilizer from cattle manure or sheep manure or something like that that's gone through a composted process, I'm allowed to use that to add fertility to the field. However, I wouldn't be allowed to use a chemical based fertilizer. So that's an easy one that often people think rather than getting into the weeds of some of the more nuanced items. If I want to grow the crops that we grow, for example, I need to grow from certified organic seed when I can find that seed available. And that's the big asterisk, is when I can find it available, and what if I can't? So if I'm going to grow a variety of carrots, I need to, if I can find that variety I'm looking for, say, Bolero, I look for an organic version of that seed. So I'm looking at multiple different seed sources. So I need to show due diligence. I've looked at 3 different seed sources in order to find that seed organic. And if I can't, then I'm allowed to find, say, that variety Bolero that's conventional, non-treated. So it means that no chemicals could have been put on a seed. So no seed coatings that were chemically based. I'm definitely not allowed to use anything that's been genetically modified, which, without going down that rabbit hole, is effectively when you have a protein from a species that is not related to the plant that you're growing. So perhaps, it's a bacteria or, another animal. And then that protein is being inserted into the crop. So those things I'm not allowed to use.
Right. And that's the distinction between genetic modification and conventional crop breeding, which to its end is genetically modifying the crop, but it's doing so kind of using the nature's way of recombinating genes and in production, and not the scientific way of inserting novel genes, like you said, from additional species or other species. I had a question. So when you say organic chemistry-based chemicals, is that what you said? Chemical?
I may have said chemical, but it would be like a petroleum-based chemical fertilizer that would not be allowed in an organic system.
Gotcha. Yeah, the
world is made of chemistry.
Yeah, I was going to say, the science student in me says, like, what's something that's not chemical-based? But I understand there's certain ways that we use the words like chemical and what that means, right? And what that comes from.
Yeah, in the same way that, if I say, I have a theory, well, maybe it's an opinion rather than a scientific
I have
theory.
a hunch.
I have a hunch.
So as the farm coordinator, what's your day-to-day look like? And I imagine that kind of changes throughout the year, but are there specific programs or partnerships that, I think you already kind of alluded to this, that help distribute the food that's grown there?
Yeah, so the day-to-day, absolutely, it depends on the time of year. So if we're thinking about right now, we're at the end of March in 2025. We are just gearing up in our greenhouse, starting to do our seeding. So up until now, it's been a lot of background work. So, ordering those seeds, ordering those materials, doing some repairs, hiring the students, all that background kind of stuff where I get to sit at a desk. And then as we start to get that warmer weather, we're going to be bringing our student volunteers in this week. For the next several weeks, they're going to be helping do a lot of seeding. So it's really awesome to be able to be connected with a whole bunch of students again on the regular. And then as the season progresses, as it gets warmer outside, we're going to be having to get those fields prepped in the end of April, into May. And then we'll be starting to plant those things all outside. So we'll start planting in our greenhouses again next month, and then out into the fields into early May once our summer students start. And then it's full speed ahead. We'll be working out there about 5 days a week. We're going to have our staff. We're going to have volunteers. We take volunteers 3 days a week throughout the summer months. And so, it's going to be full on growing produce, growing veggies, growing flowers.
What's the appetite like for volunteers? Do you have to turn down people every year, or is there kind of always more work and things that can be done?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We take on about 100 volunteers every year at different times of the year. A lot of them at the early phase is involved in seeding. I have a finite space for how many people can fit in a greenhouse, and only so many things I can seed in March. So we do have caps on some of those things. As it becomes nicer outside and we start checking off boxes and getting things done, we open up more opportunities so that we can take on more things as we have the time and the capacity and the interest from the student body to do more things. We've opened up a couple of unique volunteer opportunities this fall for students to get involved in the farm in ways that don't involve getting their hands dirty as much, a little bit more, whether it's helping us with the market, doing some cross-promotion about the farm, going into classes and talking up the farm, things like that. So there's different ways to get involved based on the students and what their interests are. as we have capacity, there's only so many of us on the team to sort of facilitate. We try to focus that enthusiasm in ways that can benefit the farm, but also benefit the broader student community.
I can only imagine how rewarding it must be for students that come from, like you said, some of the non-farming backgrounds, like people who could have grown up in condos in Toronto, who their idea of farming is just informed by some of the fields that they drive by or on their way to, like, into the city of Guelph. And now they really get to have boots on the ground experience of what that's like.
Yeah, absolutely. It's Canada's Food University. This is like the gateway to farming. And so for some people, they saw an Instagram post and they're like, farming seems cool. And they come and they do it once and they're like, that is awesome, but not for me. And that is okay.
That is a very important lesson to learn about yourself, like what you like and what you dislike, which is why it's so important to get out there and try and do different things if you're on campus and if you have, or even if you're not necessarily a student. Can non-students volunteer as well?
They can, yeah. We get about 10% of our volunteers are non-students. We have some seniors that are involved. We have some 20s and 30-somethings who are finished school. We have high school students who sometimes come out and get their hands dirty. For me, it's just I try to encourage everybody, but especially students since I'm around, to try new things and to see whether or not you like it or not, because you never know. One of our student volunteers last year, I met them at a volunteer fair, and they were in the computer science thing and had never done anything with their hands. And they came out at the beginning of the season, and then they came out almost every week, 3 days a week, and volunteered at the farm. They came out like 35, 40 times. They had never got their hands dirty. They were always behind the keyboard. They found that coming and getting their hands dirty in farming was a great way of counterbalancing what they were doing with their degree, as it's, a little more analog at times, getting your hands dirty and actually growing things. But for me, I find it's not only rewarding to see that plant grow from seed all the way to when we harvest it at the end. Something I very much value is the crop of students that come along, is to see where they came in at the beginning of their time at the farm, completely green and new, and then seeing that how the farming and agriculture has changed their perspective on the world. As a parent, there are so many lessons I have taken from agriculture that I have used and leveraged as a parent growing up. And so, while many of those students aren't quite at that life phase yet that I am, seeing how farming and agriculture and working with different life cycles changes your perspective on the world and your place in it.
Yeah, learning about the interconnectedness of our food system and broadening the understanding of food from just food, something you buy the end product of, and getting that insight into what that whole process means. It can just be very enlightening and very you can understand some of the struggles and the debates that go into our food system and the world, where things are a lot more complicated than they seem, where even if we're just talking about like the idea of organic farming, where there's obviously a good a demand for the farming, like for organic farming, and to further some of those practices. And then there's also the debates about, like, well, if the whole world went organic, what would that actually mean in terms of the inputs and how that changes? And the whole thing is very nuanced, I would say. And you probably experienced that because there's, like, you work alongside professors and researchers here at the University of Guelph that are working on those transgenic crops of the GMO crops of those techniques of, like, the very conventional farming. But it's not a one side versus the other side. They are different practices. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I am not going to judge anybody on their farming practices. I am, the organic guy here on campus. I personally think that organic solves a lot of problems, and not just agriculture problems, but environmental, social, economic. I think there's a lot of different challenges that we face as a society and as a community in which small-scale organic agriculture can show real solutions to those challenges. But guess what? There are more challenges out there. We are at a time where we have a lot of big problems to solve. And I am not ideological enough to close the door to say, let's not look in there to see whether or not you can find a novel solution to a problem. Again, personally, I think organic solves more of those. But at the same time, I'm not going to be judgmental about anybody and their pursuit of knowledge and figuring out how they can use agriculture to improve society at large.
And there's, at least in my opinion, I'm sensing an appetite in the air of people wanting to learn more about how can they, like, what can they grow in their backyard? What are they able to produce on their own? Like, if there is a community garden they could have access to, could their neighbors and them grow their own food? And I think with some of the
the bigger geopolitical climate in the air right now with tariffs and just people really taking a closer look at what the interconnectedness of the world means and what it also potentially, I guess, the pitfalls of it or the ways that it can leave societies vulnerable, where if a key chemical or a key thing that you rely on a different nation to get, and then suddenly relationships with that nation aren't as friendly, people really have to adapt. And I could see where there'd be a lot of interest of people maybe for the first time saying like, oh, maybe self-sufficiency should mean getting a good understanding of what farming in my backyard could look like, and what, like, have you seen any interest of that from the general community, especially in the last few months with our changing relationships with our geopolitical neighbors?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have, anecdotal conversations with students about some of these bigger issues. One of the things as being a farmer of any stripe, you have to adapt to the hand that you're given, because every year that weather is going to be different.
Yeah.
We're seeing more and more extreme weather events in my career, which make it challenging for any farmer anywhere. For me, one of those ways of adapting is by growing lots of different things. Since I don't know what the weather's going to be like, this upcoming growing season, by having, 60 different vegetables out there, you know what? 20 of them will probably do okay. 20 of them are going to do great, and 20 of them probably won't do so hot. I don't know which ones those are going to be yet, because as those crops have to tolerate probably, at times really hot, really cold, really wet, and really dry, rather than our typical cycle of where you have those predictability. As whether it's tariffs or what have you, that predictability is becoming more and more of a precious commodity as we try and make plans. So a lot of farmers do hedge their bets in terms of what they're going to grow and how they're going to work with that. Having a small business, your supply chains are often very narrow and small, and the more you can talk to the people in your supply chain, the better prepared you can be for whatever those issues that you might encounter are, whether it's geopolitical, big picture issues, or small local issues. Maybe there's a new development going up down the road, and that might change how the quality of the water is in your local river. If that's how you're getting your water for your garden, that might impact you too. Often what I say to folks is if they want to understand some of these other issues, is to start with the food. My education is in political science, but what I found was connecting with farmers and food was a great community connection point. You and I can have a disagreement about any number of issues, but we all need to eat. So bringing food and putting that at the core of what we do, it brings us together and have that conversation. We can eat around the table and discuss whatever the policy proposal is, whatever the new development is, or whatever the big picture challenge or debate issue is with an election coming up, perhaps. And so we all need to eat. We all need to breathe. We all need clean water. There are these core things that are definitely on our needs list. And food is a way that we can connect with each other, and then use that as a stepping stone to see how those big issues affect each and every one of us.
So I know from some of my career experience and working in agriculture, marketing, and communications that we know from polling of the Canadian public that despite mistrust that can occur and that some people hold on to about food practices in general, people very largely trust farmers. And that trust of farmers, I think it's so key, that peace of mind of what they're bringing to their dinner tables. And I think any sort of public program like this that can help just bridge that gap between the people producing the food and the people consuming the food, and shining a light and giving students and community members a chance to participate in the world of farming. I think ignorance and not understanding a situation is what kind of breeds some of that fear. So even just kind of getting the opportunity to see things and understand the practices can just go a really long way to easing the general anxieties about our food practices. And that's not to say like, oh, hey, you go volunteer at an organic farm and never question the food system at all. I think our food system should be questioned, right? But
like a lot of things, like if you think about going to a restaurant, if you can go to a restaurant and you can see that the kitchen from your table, there's a certain amount of transparency there that you as a food eater are going to feel pretty comfortable that if that chef dropped the chicken wing on the floor, he's throwing it out.
Yep.
You don't have to even look, but because that transparency is there, it helps build that trust. With the campus organic farm, we are that open kitchen. Anyone can walk by at any time and see what we're doing. We're not hiding anything. And you can talk to the people who are growing your food directly. Not everybody is in a position where they can afford to go out to a restaurant all the time, especially a restaurant that has that. The same way, I acknowledge people don't all have the opportunity to take time out of their busy schedules to come and talk to a farmer. I understand that. But any times where you can create environments where you can increase that transparency and build that community through relationships, I think is advantageous to both yourself, but also into that community strength that you can have. Because when we do have challenges, what is your support network whatever the issue is, it's usually the people around you, whether it's your neighbors or your family or your friends, but also like local businesses and local organizations who can step up and fill those voids. So when times are good, if you can work at building those relationships with your community, with local businesses, with your neighbors, when things aren't so hot, you can then lean on them. In the same way, hopefully they can lean on you if they're having an issue. Maybe a local not-for-profit is having a budget issue and they can reach out and say, hey, we have a shortfall. Maybe it's a business that you've relied on for years and they're having an issue that you can help support them in their time of need. And I think, we saw that a lot during COVID, how everybody had to change and pivot and do all those things. And it was hard. And communities did come together in other ways. They did fragment in others.
Yeah.
So it's not that they always, one size fits all, but the more that we can connect with each other and have that resilience, the better off I think collectively we'll be, whether it's a campus community or a Guelph community or an Ontario or Canadian community, which it's hard. I don't know a lot of people in Manitoba right now. It's hard for me to relate there. But one of the things that mediums like this and the internet allow us to do as a country is to stay connected and to understand that despite our geographic distances, that we do have a lot in common. I speak regularly with farming colleagues of mine who are in Nova Scotia or British Columbia. I have a student who was a former student of mine who now farms in the Yukon. And so I chat with her on a regular basis about some of the challenges that she experiences and how what she does is similar to what I do, but when you're growing in climate zone 0, you have a different set of challenges than I do on a campus where it's a complete different resource base that I have access to. But the more that we can learn from each other, the more prepared we'll be for dealing with whatever challenge happens to come.
So I can definitely get a sense of maybe a bit about how your political science background maybe informs the ways that you think about this, but I'm curious to sort of dig into your educational professional background. Like, what was your journey into this current position? If you kind of want to talk through some of that.
Sure. I mean, I originally went to school for radio and television broadcasting, and I went to McMaster University for political science, where I focused on agricultural policy. I worked on organic farms across the country in Quebec and Ontario and British Columbia to understand how policy that someone in Ottawa makes or in Queen's Park, how does that actually impact farmers on the ground? And so having that hands-on experience plus that academic experience helped me kind of understand, sort of the good and the bad of the policy world. It is a tool that can get you, a certain in some ways, but also it can help pick winners and losers in an industry for good and for bad.
Yeah.
So that was sort of my formal education. I did a certificate in project management for the University of Toronto. So, all those things weren't officially in agriculture, but I have worked in the organic ag sector for more than 20 years now. So mostly in small scale market gardening has been the core of my professional experience.
Spoken to some of the specific organic practices that I'm going to keep tripping up of saying the entire name. Do you use an acronym, GCUOF?
That's the acronym. You could, and that's why I use Campus Organic Farm.
Okay.
It's clear, it's descriptive. If I say it, people know what I'm talking about.
I'll say Campus Organic Farm or the farm.
Yeah, that's fine.
Maybe you could talk through some of the sustainable and organic farming techniques they're used here on the farm, and how do these practices benefit both the environment and work in tandem with the local food system?
Okay, wow, that's a big question. So growing, 80 different plant species on the farm, each one needs different things, albeit similar things. They need nutrients, but what nutrients they need and how long they're in the ground all vary depending on the species. So, for example, some things that we do is that we will apply mulch, so straw mulch. We planted garlic in the fall. We had a whole bunch of students that we planted that garlic in the ground around Thanksgiving, and then we put a whole bunch of straw down. And what that does is it helps suppress the weeds, so we're not going to get any weeds that come up. It's going to help insulate that garlic over the winter. So as that garlic might come up and down out of the ground, depending on how deep it was planted from the frost and thaw that happens in the winter or the spring. So it helps insulate it to keep it from freezing if that were to happen. And then it also helps conserve moisture. So that moisture then stays in the ground. I don't have to really irrigate it. In my 20-odd years of farming, I don't think I've ever irrigated garlic. It's important, though, not to plant your garlic in a low area because if you have a wet spring, it's now underwater.
Right.
So there is that conservation of moisture, which, if it turns out to be a crazy wet year, could be a detriment. But you roll the dice. We planted in a high spot, hoping that the moisture conservation the straw would do would be adequate. And then we'll pull that up. We'll harvest in July, our garlic, and then that straw will be incorporated back into the soil, helping to build organic matter. So by using a natural material in that space, it had beneficial cultivated technique aspects by suppressing weeds, conserving soil moisture, but then by incorporating it back into the soil in the later part of the season, it will then become soil itself. It'll add organic matter to our soil profile. So that particular crop, it can have that. Something like a lettuce or a spinach or something that's in and out of the ground very, very quickly. By the time I put that straw down around that lettuce, it'll be time to pull up the lettuce, harvest the lettuce. So it's not all techniques are going to be great for all things. If I want to save the seed from that lettuce, well, I don't know how often you guys see flowers on your lettuce when you go to the grocery store. Probably never, because it's going to grow about 6 feet tall. So depending on what the goal is of that crop will determine how long it's going to be in the ground. Compared to a tomato, in which we're harvesting that right off the vine, and we can save those seeds from it if we have it isolated. So in terms of some of those production techniques that could help the environment, things like planting cover crops, which or green manure or service crops are all a fancy way of saying I'm going to plant something on the ground with the goal of not harvesting it. Often these are field crops, things like oats or peas or rye, different grasses, different legumes. Those things will help build your soil, hold your soil by taking things deep down with their roots out of the soil profile that your crop might not be able to get. And as it brings it up, your cover crop is effectively composted on the soil. So either it'll die in the winter or you'll mow it down. And so that way you are using plants to help sequester carbon out of the atmosphere and help get nutrients out of the ground and then decompose on the surface or slightly incorporate into the soil. So that way the next crop you're growing can have access to increased fertility. So that is something that we absolutely incorporate on the farm. Usually between 30 and 50% of the farm is in cover crops at any given time, depending on what it is. Usually depending on the soil profile and what we're planning on doing, will determine which combination of those cover crops we'll use. So that's one thing as well. So things like straw mulches, things like cover crops, also adding things like compost is a great way of, we get it on campus, we have the cattle here on site, and so we compost that, and then we add that as additional fertility as well, which can really help build your soil profile as well.
It sounds like volunteers and students that come through here probably leave the program with lifelong techniques and things that they will probably use in their home gardens for the rest of their growing days, as long as they're growing things.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the student. It depends on what they're wanting to do. Often, as an urban space, most of us are coming at this from an urban perspective, urban lens. And so, how do you can leverage your experience on the farm after you leave? I think anybody who's tried growing a tomato or some beans in their backyard in a pot or something, you may not have got the biggest harvest of tomatoes out of that plant, or the biggest or anything. But I bet you ate it regardless of what it looked like, unless it was like an animal got into it or something. And that's because that connection you have with that plant, the work that you went into it, it changes your perspective into the value of food. So much of food is wasted somewhere in the food chain, in the production cycle from seed to table. But if you've gone to the work yourself to grow that, you are valuing it far differently. And our hope is that by having more students get that experience of connecting with food, seeing how much work goes into growing it, that, you know, when they go home or they go to the grocery store, they see that stuff. They have an idea of what happens before it got to you.
Right.
Onions don't grow on trees, as one student asked. Nope, they grow in the ground. Let's see how that is. And so by understanding the amount of work that goes into it, it gives that additional value than just money out of pocket.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, hopefully a little bit of gratitude to the people who spend their life growing it.
I can also imagine, listening to some of the techniques you were just walking through, I have the benefit of like a decade plus career of working in agriculture. So I'm pretty well sure I understood about 99% of it. But do you ever find yourself walking through or talking through something with students and they kind of have to stop you and say like, hey, I'm an arts major. I grew up in a condo. It's my first time on a field. Like, can you walk through a couple of those terms you just used? Or like, is there a lot of kind of needing to break things down to the very basics and like definitional ways of talking through things and reasons for why we do things and performing?
Yeah. And so being an entry level space where people can come and it's their first time, often those conversations happen where I want folks to feel welcome. I want people to feel invited to come into that space. And so it's somewhere when we're talking about what we need to do and we train about the task at hand, we try to keep jargon to a minimum, and just explain what we're doing and why we're doing it in plain language so that it can be as accessible as possible. As people are there and they learn a little more, you know, we'll throw out some terms like cover crops or something, but you might just know it as, hey, there's some peas and sunflowers growing over there. What's up with that?
Mm-hmm.
And we can talk about it like that as well. I really feel, you know, you got to speak to your audience and meet them where they're at if they're going to come along with you.
So speaking about the challenges of, say, growing backyard tomatoes, I found one of the biggest challenges I've had with growing food in my backyard here in Guelph is the local squirrel population that likes to be viciously go after everything I try to grow. Can you speak to like what are some of the pest challenges that you have growing here on campus in the arboretum?
Yeah, so like most farmers, we do get some pests from insects. But at the same time, there's only a handful of them that are actually going to do much damage. Most of the ones that we have on the farm are benign or are beneficial. So don't go squishing every bug you see is my first thing I'll say. But it is important to know and identify what those pests are. Is it a squirrel actually eating your tomato, or is it a skunk that's coming out in the middle of the night?
It's a good question. I could be needlessly disparaging. I've seen some of the squirrels do this, but I know we do have skunks in the neighborhood as well, and they can be pretty destructive as well.
Yeah, and if you think about it, like we're sharing this habitat, and you just grew this great thing for them, and they're super grateful for you for having grown that tomato for their snack, right? That's their perspective on it. And so I'd say, first identify what those pests are in your garden. So sometimes you could look for tracks. That might give you a clue if you don't physically see the squirrel or the skunk out there snacking on your vegetables or your flowers, as the case may be. So understanding what they are. And this is where, as a farmer, as a gardener, it's a really long horizon look. You know, I've grown potatoes for 25 years, but that means I've only done it 25 times. And so if I make a mistake, it's like, well, I'll try again next year.
Yeah.
And so there's definitely that learning curve can be kind of steep. So identify, maybe your first year you'll see something that you can't solve immediately, but now you know for next year. One major thing that we'll use at the farm that folks can use too is something called row cover. It's a big white sheet that you put over your garden and over your crops. It kind of is the consistency of like a fabric softener sheet, if you can picture that out there. It's sort of like white. It's kind of translucent. It lets through about 80% of light and moisture. Some of them you can buy out there have like a 5-degree bump, so keep it a little bit warm. Some of them don't have any. It's more like the material of a screen on your screen door. And it can act as a physical barrier. So it lets the light through, it lets the moisture through, but it's a physical barrier so that pests and animals can't actually get to your crop.
Is that sounds like something that people might be familiar just seeing, like on the, looking at farms from the highway or from roads? What are some crops grown like locally around here that people might see? Something like that covering them?
Yeah, so anything in the brassica family, which many of your listeners probably goes, I don't remember seeing brassica at the grocery store. However, it's probably most of the things you see at the grocery store. So it is everything from broccoli to cauliflower to cabbage. but also radishes and arugula, collard greens, mustard, canola oil. All those things are all part of the brassica family. And so some farmers, often I will see row cover in Ontario over things like broccoli and cabbage, because those are big crops. They're going to be in the ground a long time, and it's a physical barrier they can put over the crop. And so that means they don't need to spray it with any kind of pesticides, as you're just stopping the bugs from getting to it. It is a little fragile. You can find these at garden centers. Canadian Tire, I've seen it. William Dam Seeds in Flamborough, I've seen it available. Dubois Agri Innovation is a website you can get. They're based, I think, in Simcoe. You can order it online from them. Irrigation Plus. There are some smaller companies that do carry like the residential size. Like, I want 5 feet by 10 feet size pieces. Not I want 10 feet or 10 meters by 25 meters size pieces.
So outside of the pests, what are some of the other biggest challenges that you've encountered in managing this farm? And I guess the flip side of that are what are some of your biggest successes or your milestones you're most proud of? You could start with the challenges first if you'd like. Or
challenges. Oh yeah, obviously it's the weather. I don't know. Most farmers, I think that would always rank high, only because it's a major piece of unpredictability.
Yeah.
Like last year was turning out to be a great growing season, and then beginning of July we had 200 mils of rain in about a week, and we had a field flood. So that's about half of our growing space was underwater, and several centimeters underwater, if not up to a foot of water. It was a lot. So in agriculture, sometimes I did all the things I could do.
Yep.
I checked off all the boxes on my planning list of what I needed to do to be successful growing that crop, but then you get those major curveballs.
Yeah. And it puts you in a position where you have to then decide, do you install new drainage lines? Do you invest in that on the farm if you're trying to combat an event that could occur only once every 10 years, or could it occur more frequently as the climate changes? Or as a parallel to this, I'm thinking about this as a homeowner, because with all the recent, the crazy amount of ice and snow that we had, I have a little extension built into my house that has a flat roof. Been perfectly fine so far, 5 years living there. And then this year, that roof leaked just with the crazy icicles that we have. And it makes me have to now question, okay, is there major repairs I have to consider in the flat roof? Or is it just something where if once every 5 to 10 years we get crazy ice storms, I can expect a little bit of leaking? And you kind of have to weigh that pros and cons. And
yeah, you absolutely have to look at your resource base and make those judgment calls.
Everything costs money and time.
Everything costs money and time. So how much are you going to get from, in an agricultural perspective, how many dollars would I gain potentially from not having a crop failure versus the cost of the infrastructure, on top of all the other potential infrastructure costs or investments I want to be putting into. So there is a bit of an ebb and flow if I'm going to install tile drainage. But like everybody else, we had a lot of snow on our greenhouses. They were about half the size of a snow. Well, half the size of the building of snowdrifts on either side as the snow had all shed it off. And so a couple weeks ago, I was outside digging ditches around one of my greenhouses because there was water starting to get inside. It was installed in a low place, and so knowing that the rest of the snow would melt, I dug ditches inside the structure as well as outside the structure so that the water would channel to the way that I wanted it to. So that was just my time. I could afford to spend an afternoon digging some ditches versus the other things. But in terms of some of those challenges, yeah, for sure. The weather is always number one. In terms of successes we've had here, we've been building up the farm since COVID. And so really building up a network and a community of students who are invested and are interested in being involved has been a fabulous success, I'd say, of the program so far. We have thousands of people visit the site every year, and hundreds of them are volunteering and getting involved in eating the food. And I see those successes as building on each other as more students are getting literally harvesting the fruits of their labor and sharing it with their friends. You see more people coming and knocking on the door, wanting to get involved, or just explore to say, hey, what is this? And so whether it's through events that we're doing or tours, people want to know more about what's happening.
There's so many benefits, too, of the being educated in the field that you might never work directly in, but now you have an understanding of that you can carry for the rest of your life. And earlier in this conversation, you were speaking about an engineering student who
computer science
student. And that's a situation where that computer science student might never have considered that there were jobs in agriculture, but then they might go on and discover that, hey, if I actually combine my computer science skills with some basic understanding of agriculture, now suddenly that could open the door to career opportunities working in digital farming, where there's people who have to build these digital tools. And if those people building the tools have even any kind of knowledge of agriculture, it can help inform the building of those tools. And I know when I was a student, I was sometimes ignorant of the power of knowing a little bit about niche fields like that. And I imagine you've probably heard of people taking the lessons that they've learned from this and incorporating them in kind of interesting ways in their careers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my career, I've mentored well over 100 students from the beginning to the end of the season of, the practices and principles of organic agriculture. Some of those folks have gone on to run their own small farms. Many of them have not.
Yeah.
And that's okay too. And they've gone a different direction. I imagine every one of them are still advocates for farming and agriculture. And personally, I find a lot of growing food and being involved in agriculture very personally rewarding. But I think most people get that sense of belonging and feeling of fulfillment when they can take their different passions. And if you can combine a couple of your different passions in a different way so that you can use your talents and your skills, that's a super awesome way. And that's, they say that, necessity is the mother of all invention.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you have different experiences of a lot of different things, you're going to start seeing these little niches that are either, maybe it's an untapped market and that's an opportunity for a business. Maybe it's seeing a solution to a problem that your community is experiencing. Mm-hmm. Or maybe it's just like a really cool thing you figured out and you want to, do some social media posts and say, hey, has anyone ever done this before? I love photography. And one thing I love about photography is taking a little thing that thousands of people have walked by and showing it in a different light that then pulls everyone's attention to say, hey, I've never thought of looking at it from that perspective. And so, yeah, for me, you see a lot of that.
What are your future goals for the Center for Urban Organic Farming? Do you have any upcoming projects or initiatives that you're kind of particularly excited about or that you'd like to share?
Sure. And so like right now, the last few years, I've been in this role for about 4 years. And the last few years, I've really seen it as getting reestablished post-COVID and rebuilding some of our infrastructure. I foresee the next few years is now that we have more of a solid foundation under us, we can now we have that reliability, a little bit of predictability of what our capacity is. So we're really leaning into using that capacity to grow more food on campus so that more students can, get that subsidized food. Life is crazy expensive. We want to get that good food into as many students as we can. My personal philosophy is the more good food you eat, the better you're going to be to make good decisions in your own life. Because I don't need to judge. I'm not in a position to judge or know what your world is or what challenges you have to face. But we've all been in a position when we've eaten poorly. Maybe we've been traveling and we've been stopping at rest stops, eating chips or hamburgers or something. You do that for a few days in a row, you feel kind of down. You feel kind of gross. And it's amazing what a salad will do to kind of help pick you back up out of that.
Yeah.
So for me, looking forward for the farm is to, be more, to continue to be relevant and to connect with more students, more courses, getting good food into as many students as we can, and to continue to be a place where students can try things. So often in the world, especially as we're adults, we're not given space to fail. Mm-hmm. It's often looked at very negatively, and especially in academia, like you always want to be successful in corporate life. You need, you got to be held accountable for your failures. Being in an institution like this, we have the opportunity to fail and to learn from that failure. I don't want to fail like 50% of the time. Don't get me wrong. That's a little too much. I don't think I'm going to learn all the lessons I need to learning if I'm failing 50% of the time. But if I'm failing 10, maybe 15% of the time, that's still an A.
Yeah.
But I'm given the opportunity then to learn from those and to leverage those and to use the privilege we have at the Guelph Center for Urban Organic Farming to share that knowledge with our broader community, whether it's students or whether or not it's the broader agriculture community, whether it's through local farming organizations that we're members of or more anecdotal things that we're doing with colleagues of ours. So an example that I've been working on the last couple of years is growing certified organic fresh ginger here in Ontario. The first year, I called it my year of failures. I did not know how to grow it. There wasn't a lot of information growing it in a temperate climate in Ontario. Mm-hmm. And so I tried to grow it a lot of different ways, and I failed at growing it a lot of different ways. But that failure narrowed down the path to how to be successful at it. Mm-hmm. And so then the following year, I leveraged that knowledge, continued to learn, continued to read, to talk to colleagues who are also working on this across Canada, parts of the United States, to do that again. And this past year, we were super successful at it. We grew 125 pounds of certified organic fresh ginger. We sold a lot to hospitality. We had it available for market for students as a way of sharing that. And we're going to leverage that experience again this year, and we're going to do more of it, but also do it still differently. Let's see if we can make it even better to know where those lines are.
I know kind of anecdotally from my experience with farmers that, as you said, farmers can do everything right and the crop can still go badly due to things outside their control. And I think some of that unpredictability can lead farmers to have, I don't want to say paranoid, but maybe like rituals that they believe in, good luck practices, things that they won't stray from because of the superstition. There's like a superstitiousness that can sometimes grow within farming. Just curious, have you ever found yourself having to actively combat that style of thinking in yourself where maybe having been burned by a past failure, there's a small tendency perhaps to say, oh, we can't do that because it went wrong in the past? Or do you find you're able to sort of keep an open mind and stop that from building up a history of what not to do?
I would say that's a yes and a no question or answer. And it's nuanced this way. When you have a learning curve in agriculture that can be, years or decades long, that potato example, I've only done it 25 times. Oops, got to try again next year. The next year, I really want to learn from that error and do it differently.
Yeah.
For years, I grew acreages of potatoes. I came into this position. I don't have a potato digger. I'm not growing acres of them. It's a different scale. And how do I leverage the previous years of success to grow them successfully here? I grew them great. And because I didn't have a potato digger, I rely on students to help pick them. And then inevitably what happens, half those potatoes or more get stabbed with a pitchfork. So then you're like, oh, well, we've spent 4 months of work to have a lot of shish kebabs of these dirty potatoes that nobody wants. And so then it's we have now the last several years growing them in pots, large, 14-gallon pots, and trying to tailor that. It's a great urban opportunity. You can grow potatoes in your driveway if you want with this approach. It's not how I ever thought to do them before in a rural setting because of economies of scale and everything. But for that urban space, it probably makes more sense to do them in pots because you just pick up the pot and with your kids, you can say, hey, let's go find the potato rather than jab, jab, jab and cry, cry, cry. So there's some part of that of where that, how do I take the previous year's learning and leverage that? And one of the great ways of being around so many people new to agriculture is that every year people ask sometimes the same questions. Why do we do it this way? And having grown some plants, it's like, well, if you grow those tomatoes too close together, it's going to be a big tangled tomato mess. I don't need to do that experiment again to see a big mess of tomatoes. Trust me on this one. Let's give it 1.5 feet and we'll see how they look. However, there are other things that students will ask me of why do we do it a certain way? And I try to create the space of where if I don't have a good answer, I say, well, let's give it a try. Let's do a trial doing it your way. I don't have a good reason of why we've always done it. Let's see if yours works better. And in my experience over the years, every now and again, an error, a mistake happens. There was once years ago where students accidentally seeded a tray twice. Oops. So now we have 2 crops growing in the same tray. Well, that's probably going to be bad, but I can't tell yet because they're in the soil.
Yeah.
And so for those ones, we let them germinate, come to out, and then we thinned them out. And so it meant that one of the crops we typically grew on one size tray was now in a different size tray. And it turned out that was actually a way better crop. They did way better in that tray. And so then we changed the tray size going forward on that one. And it came out of an accident, an error. And so that turned out to be, initially maybe costly because I wasted, a couple dollars of seed. But ultimately, for the improvement of crop over the years, it actually was a very cheap error for the increased gain that we got.
It's interesting. Some of this is really speaking to the advantages that a academic institution where, as you said before, the trial and error can be encouraged versus in more corporate settings where every dollar has to be accounted for. Every dollar is either owned by someone or, owed to shareholders, where trial and error is more frowned upon and things need to produce results. And situations like that where a simple mistake would probably just in a production greenhouse in a corporate setting, we'll scrap that, do it again, because we do it the same way in, same way out. But then you're kind of limiting your opportunities for those accidental discoveries like that. So
yeah, and so what I often try to tell our students, it's like, it's okay to fail, but let's just try to fail small first.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're going to try the experiment of like, let's plant like way too many cabbages, in my opinion, for, in our bed, we can try it, but let's do the first meter of the bed with like tons of cabbages, and then we'll do our normal spacing, because we don't want to lean into a maybe for all the time and effort it's going to take us to grow that crop.
Yeah.
But then we can put a sign up, and then that way it's not just us who will learn whatever the lesson is. It can be everybody who visits the farm can then learn that lesson. So that way it's not keeping it in a box behind a paywall. Anyone who comes to visit can go, oh, well, if we plant, 42 cabbages in 1 square meter, how big are those cabbages going to be?
I can only imagine, and I know we kind of spoke to some of this during their tour, but every single growing season is just a incredible wealth of institutional knowledge for yourself, where it's building like the practices, the techniques, the understanding every square foot of space that you're using, and like you talked about low-lying areas getting flooded and things like that. Like all of this puts pressure on the knowledge that you're building in your mind, right? And what are your some of your efforts in terms of getting that knowledge down into either in text or in like a shareable format, so that it, I guess, I won't say outlives you, but that it kind of lives outside of your mind, and the next person in this role can take advantage of it.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, farming for 25 years, you get a lot of experience.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing going to replace that experience.
Yeah.
No book that you're going to read is going to then give you the experience of the author of that book.
Yeah.
However,
you just upload all of your
you just can't,
knowledge.
Go in the Matrix and push a button and now you know Kung Fu. But what we are trying to do is to try and keep records of what we're doing. Mm-hmm. So whether all of our planting schedules, all of our yield logs, all of that documentation that we get is saved in our files. And every now and again, students, for their own research, approach us saying, hey, do we know? I have a question. Do you have answers? And that's the kind of stuff that we'll share with students if they're interested and have a need for it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't post it on a bulletin board but at the same time, I could. Mm-hmm. I have been trying to break things out of my brain more and make them more accessible by using some additional digital tools, and also trying to simplify some of the work that we do. Now that we have some of the capacity infrastructure that I alluded to earlier in our conversation, I am starting to develop, the classic standard operating procedures, so that whoever walks into this chair next will have the opportunity to be like, well, this is what worked before. And they can, whoever it is, can decide whether or not if that's the direction that they want to continue taking the program. Maybe, things are going to change in the future. They always do. And maybe if not for no other reason, they knew what worked before in the context of today. Whether or not that will work tomorrow in that context will be a different story. But maybe it's going, well, because it worked then, in that circumstance, let's do something different because we have a new circumstance. Let's not just copy and paste that for some aspect of the farm. Maybe all of it. I don't know. I don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. But getting things out of my head, for organic certification purposes, but also for the program, I think is important.
Mm-hmm. So for my last question for you, for people who are maybe listening to this and they are either in a similar role that you were a couple years ago when you first got this role, or they are in a position where they maybe could start an initiative like this at their school, at their organization, where would you recommend people get started? What are some resources that you'd point them towards? What helped you in your journey? What would your advice be for people in that situation?
Sure, yeah. So, I got started in agriculture in 2003. It's been a little while. And at the time, there was a lot less talk about market gardening, about organic agriculture. You couldn't find organic food at most stores. Mm-hmm. It was a different environment then. Looking forward to today and what people have, I would say, depending on the details of your project, if you don't have experience, I would recommend trying to get some, whether it's volunteering on a farm, whether it's working on a farm, having a couple seasons under your belt, preferably, in the ideal world, on a dry year and a wet year would be really helpful to understand how that's going to change what you need to do in order to react to the plants and what their needs are. The other thing I would suggest is, if depending on your level of experience, is starting small. Maybe that's a 100 square foot garden. Maybe that's an acre. Maybe that's 10 acres. It depends on where you're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
Because infrastructure is expensive, because your time is worth a lot, I would say, yeah, start where you're at and learn from others. Try to meet those farmers, ask them why. If you volunteer on a farm, you can usually work next to a farmer and ask them any questions you want. They're more than happy to share what they know. Being connected with your local farming organizations, whether it's something like the National Farmers Union or the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario, the Canadian Organic Growers. There's a lot of different farming organizations out there that have tons and tons of people who have, eons worth of experience in organic ag, in which you can connect to those communities in your local area and learn from those people. And usually they have lots of workshops and farm tours and all sorts of stuff to help connect to that community. So that community aspect, I'd say, is really important.
That community aspect is key. And I think something that I didn't really appreciate until I worked in agriculture is that if you're ever in a rural Tim Hortons and you see a group of people who, don't want to judge, but you could maybe take a guess that they're a group of farmers sitting together talking, they're not just connected at that point through the love of Timbits and Tim Hortons coffee. It's that connection point of farmers getting together, sharing their successes, sharing some of their trials and errors that you were talking about. And yeah, farmers just, they really do rely on each other in that way for that knowledge share.
Absolutely. Regardless of the stripe of your farmer, like rural communities are tight-knit places. People have lived and worked together for a long time, and they rely on each other when things, are hard.
Yep.
And maybe that's, a disaster, but maybe it's just that it's been a wet year and you need to get your hay off your field. And so I'll come and help you and you come and help me. And it's more of that informal relationship where sharing equipment and sharing time to do that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's so key. Finally, I'll just say too, is that if you're, depending on the project that you're planning on starting, your garden, if you're planning, understand where is the crop going and understanding that before you plant your crop.
Right.
If you have a tomato in your hand, it has a shelf life and the clock is ticking.
Yeah.
Knowing ahead of time where that's going to go before you plant it is going to save you a lot of stress in growing that, and understanding what your resource base is. I would say, like anything, come up with whether it's a business or an organization, whatever it is, that enterprise, come up with a really solid plan first and identify a holistic approach to make your plan really good first. Then when you come to a fork in the road, and this, regardless of whether they're talking about gardening or not, if you make a good plan for your business, for a relationship or what have you, if you identify what you want to get out of it, what your goals are for it, what your values are, and you figure that out before you plant a seed, before you move in with your partner. If you start thinking about that stuff at the very beginning, it makes it so much easier once you start having to make decisions what the right action is for you and your context.
Right.
Because a fork in the road, well, it's going to go left, straight, or right, maybe, which way you're going to go. Well, if you're in Guelph and you're going to Toronto and you have some roadblocks along the way, it may not be the most direct route you can go anymore. So what's the best choice? And if you've thought about that ahead of time, you're more likely to get to your goal.
It sounds like if someone is in that situation where they're wanting to be to create a project like this, to create a community like this, that they might think the time to do that is springtime, maybe closer to now in the weather. But it sounds like the time to do that is almost like in the dead of winter, where you're like, okay, no real time to break ground, but maybe, like you said, a lot of time has to be spent behind a notepad, in front of a computer screen, in front of people who have a similar experience at libraries, at conferences, and that's kind of the time for that.
As a farmer, you're thinking about last year's crop, this year's crop, and next year's crop. So usually, in August, I'm starting to really think about, what is next year going to be for some things? I don't have to have the whole picture painted with all the details, but am I going to do it landscape or am I going to do a portrait? What are those high level detailed decisions that I'm going to have to make? Because as a grower, you're going to have to do something in the fall that's going to impact the winter, which in turn is going to impact the spring. And so if I planted rye, say, and I planted it too late in the fall, it's going to overwinter. And now I have rye that I need to deal with in the spring. It's going to be green. It's going to be growing. how am I dealing with that? That cover crop is now a weed. It's okay if I want it as a cover crop there, if that's my goal. But if my goal is to plant an early thing in that space and it's now super muddy in that space, I now have a weed that I'm fighting in a time where I have limited tools. Like my toolbox is limited for how I'm going to deal with that. And so knowing that goal, and so depending on what you want to do, if you're just mucking around for fun, get a community garden plot, have some fun, plant some stuff, see how it goes. But if you're really going to invest your time and your money into starting a big project, I would highly recommend taking the time to come up with a really solid plan first. The field will still be there next spring.
Well, it sounds like one of the resources that people have in this position, especially if they're located in and around the Guelph area, which they probably are if they're listening to this podcast, is to reach out to you and to get some of the same experience I got to have today with this tour. So if people want to learn more about yourself and the program, I can obviously include links in the show notes, but where would you direct people to either reach out to you if they're interested or to just kind of learn more about the program?
Yeah, you can check the University of Guelph's website, the Guelph Center for Urban Organic Farming. We're pretty active on our Instagram page, so that would be a place to look us up.
You mean on top of all your other hats, you are also a social media manager?
You got to do everything as a farmer. You got to do it all. Yeah, so whenever you see a big lag between posts, you know that's when I'm actually farming.
Right. You mean it's not vacation time for you then? Or
yeah, I really am. My default is not social media. I'm not a huge fan. I don't do much on my spare time. But yeah, but you can see videos, you can see pictures of the farm all right there. If you want to get your hands dirty, you can either DM us through that, or there should be a link to our volunteering calendar right on there. And if you don't see it, if anything that you read, you message through to the Guelph Center for Urban Organic Farming. It all gets funneled to me eventually, and I'm happy to connect with you and give you guys the resources in order to get your hands dirty.
Very cool. Well, Mike, thanks so much for inviting me into the farm space today and into your office. I think it's a really, really cool program that you're running here, and I can see how it benefits every student on campus, whether they know it or not, actually, and how I think it's just a really cool program, and I guess just best of luck in continuing to build this out. And I think there's a admirable what you've been able to build here.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to speak with your audience and to get to know you a little bit over the course of this afternoon.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Growing Guelph. I've been your host, Jordan Sloggett. Be sure to subscribe to us on social media, on your favorite podcast app, and if you have a recommendation for a future guest you'd like me to speak to, you can reach out to me at growingguelph@gmail.com.